My name is Paul, and I am an anthropologist. I work in Indonesian Borneo, the Indonesian part of a very large island, which is known mostly for orangutans and oil palm. But I've been spending a lot of time with people that conserve the orangutans and other parts of nature. And one thing that I noticed about nature conservationists is that they like to tell stories of personal transformation. These often take the form of origin stories. People will say, I was just traveling the world, minding my own business, and then I saw a baby orangutan. I looked into the baby orangutan's eyes, and it was a plea for help. And since then, I've devoted my life to the cause of orangutan conservation. There's many similar stories, like I used to have a nice brook behind my house, and I would find butterflies and many nice animals there. And then one day, a big company polluted the brook, and I felt I have to make sure that other brooks and the nice wildlife in those brooks don't fall to the same fate. Now, those are very nice and inspiring stories, but personally, I've always had a problem with them, which is that I don't have a good origin story. So I work in conservation, but I came to conservation because during the open day of university, I was lost on this new campus. I entered the wrong room. It was full of conservationists, and somehow I never left this room. You know, I tried to study anthropology, but then I'm still doing the anthropology of nature conservationists. But as an anthropologist, I also have a professional concern about these stories, especially when they are used to portray the frontiers of conservation, like those areas that are marked by rapid degradation of the environment, like Indonesian Borneo. And in those places, in villages, you often find people who tell very similar stories of personal transformation. They will say, for example, I used to be a logger, and I never really thought about the effect of this on the environment. I just went on my business because it was good business. And then conservationists came to my forest, and I thought, they're strange people. But after talking to them for a while, I started to realize they were right. And I'd been wrong all this time. I had been destroying the environment. So then usually they feel quite bad about it, but luckily the conservationists offer them the opportunity to plant trees and atone for their past sins. So as you may understand, conservation organizations really like these stories, and they promote them through blogs, through videos, and through newspaper articles. However, if this is the main story that is used to portray these areas, then I think we lose a layer of complexity. So let me take you now to a small village in Indonesian Borneo with lots of oil palm, a bit of forest. And I was walking around there talking to people, hearing stories which were quite similar, but with an extra layer of complexity. And I think that made a lot of difference. So what you do when you're an anthropologist, you just kind of hope that people are willing to talk to you and you listen to whatever they want to say. So there's a man sitting in front of his house, and I say, hi, I'm an anthropologist, you might have heard of me, like I'm studying this village. And he says, okay, I'm Mr. Awan, so I'll call him Kakek Awan. And then we start to talk about the weather. So the day before there was a big storm, and Kakek Awan was sharing that he felt very lucky because he parked his motorbike not under the tree from which a huge branch had fallen. So his motorbike was still there. But then he continued by reflecting that these years there were more and more storms. And that was because, he thought, they had cut down so much of their forest. So now I'm listening really carefully because suddenly we're talking about environmentalism and conservation. And you know, probing a bit more and listening to his story, it turns out that he gets these ideas from when he was a young man. A Dutch researcher came to his village and hired him to come with him to the forest for long days of counting orangutan nests. That was quite an experience. Like this man, he would always have these binoculars that could make things that were very far seem very nearby. And he would never eat rice, so he would just bring bread. But he brought some rice for Kakek Awan. Another thing about this man was that he didn't like to kill any animals. So Kakek Awan wasn't allowed to catch any fish while he was in the forest, but he wasn't even allowed to kill mosquitoes or leeches, even though they sucked his blood. Why? Well, the researcher explained, because these animals also have souls, you know, and we shouldn't just kill them. Now, what interested me about the story of Kakek Awan was that he was very willing to be transformed by the ideas of conservation. He had taken on these ideas about trees are very important, and we need to protect them, and he was still spreading that message until today. But he didn't take on all of the ideas that conservation brought to him. He thought, trees are lovely, mosquitoes aren't, and that's not going to change for me. So I feel like this kind of open but critical attitude towards conservation principles can also be seen today in how projects are implemented. So for example, there's this big thing called carbon forestry now, which is about climate change mitigation. So basically, countries and companies have to meet certain targets to reduce their emissions. And they can either burn fewer fossil fuels, or they can, or additionally, ideally, they buy carbon credits. And that money that they use to buy carbon credits is then used to stop deforestation in other places, for example. One of those places was the village where Kakaawan lived, where this little piece of forest was funded by selling carbon credits. Now, that was widely seen as a success story, but shortly before I arrived, they had a problem, namely that several hectares of the forest had been cut down by a man who was planning to plant cassava there, like a new species of cassava, because there was a new factory asking for this. And there was a problem because you can't sell carbon credits if your forest is being cut down. So the conservationists said, we think Frankie, who was the man who cut these trees, we think he doesn't understand conservation yet. So we just go to him and talk and explain that this is a carbon forest and you're not supposed to cut it down. You know? So during my research, I met Frankie and I asked him, what did you think about it, that these people came to you and started talking to you about carbon forestry? And actually, he really agreed. He was like, yeah, they were right. I was wrong. And we shouldn't be cutting down these forests because they are the lungs of the world, etc. So he was quite convinced, but at the same time, he still had a problem with this project, namely that he had just bought this land for a lot of money. And he had also spent a lot of money into deforesting it. And the people he bought the land from claimed that they hadn't known that it was a carbon forest, and he hadn't known that it was a carbon forest. So, who was going to pay him back? Now, nobody paid him back, but luckily the conservationists were reasonable people, and they said, okay, we'll help you. You can't plant these cassava plants there, but we can give you seedlings for fruit trees, and then when the fruit trees grow up, you can harvest the fruit. So in a way, this was well managed, and people were happy in the end. Now, what interests me about this story is that it's a story of transformation, but different from the stories of personal transformation that are often told. Here it's not only Frankie who was transformed, but also carbon forestry, because now carbon forestry has to take into account the interests and the needs of the people who own the land that's being conserved. Whereas previously, the owners of the land hadn't even known that there was a carbon forest. Now, a man was actively involved in replanting the carbon forest. So I think that as a model of conservation is much more realistic. I think that's much more what actually happens than conservation going to a place and being duplicated and everyone becoming the same type of conservationist. Rather, what happens is conservation goes to a place and has to adapt and becomes a different type of conservation. And what you end up with is a diversity of conservations. And I think that this should be reflected in the stories that we tell.